the final installment of American Associations Week 2020. I've been looking forward to this event all week, not simply because it culminates the week and now us on staff can take a brief breath, but I'm joined today by three of my favorite people in the ASAE policy universe. And also, importantly, to celebrate Andrew Grossman, JD, Majority Chief Tax Counsel for the Ways and Means Committee in the House, with ASAE's Sentinel Award for his terrific work just throughout all the issues he covers, but also his pragmatism and welcoming nature, particularly in regard to issues important to our nonprofit association community. But before, Andrew, before we give you the detailed introduction, I do want to highlight our honored speakers today. Again, two of my favorite people whom I've worked with since joining ASAE. First, we have Shannon McCracken, CEO of the Nonprofit Alliance. And Shannon, before the Nonprofit Alliance, was with Charity Navigator as the Chief Development Officer and spent 17 years with Special Olympics. And I have gotten to know the Nonprofit Alliance pretty well, particularly Mark McCauley, the Vice President of Government Affairs. He and I have worked closely together on a few issues. And I have looked at Nonprofit Alliance as a terrific organization in a similar one to ASAE in that it represents many of those broad-based issues that span wide communities in the tax-exempt sector. And from my perspective, more often than not, those broad-based issues overlap for the different sectors of the tax-exempt community, and in certain cases in nonprofit as well. And elucidating some of those issues and finding some mutual solutions with Nonprofit Alliance has been great. And one last thing that Shannon may not be aware of, if we rewind back to March of 2019, when I was a fresh employee with ASAE, on maybe my third or fourth day, I joined the Nonprofit Alliance for a Senate briefing they had on data privacy. And, it might not be a huge marker in Shannon's mind, but for me, it was one of the first external forays in my job at ASAE. So I have a vivid recollection of that. And since then have very much enjoyed working with the Nonprofit Alliance. We also are privileged to have with us Scott Wiley, President and CEO of the Ohio Society of CPAs. I've always really liked working with Scott, not simply because he lives in Columbus, which happens to be my favorite place on the planet. And if you're curious as to why, we can talk about that at another time. But Scott, beyond just being the president and CEO of such an important state group, was also for a few years ago, the chair of ASAE. So that is obviously quite a big deal, at least in my book. And currently, Scott is chair of ASAE's Public Policy Committee. So he and I work together very closely on a regular basis. Scott is gracious with his time and his effort with supporting ASAE initiatives. And I have very much enjoyed working with him. So with that, Shannon, I will turn things over to you if you would like to give some opening remarks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. And I'd forgotten that was one of your first days coming to that Senate briefing. So thanks for the reminder on that. I'm really honored and pleased to be with you here today. The Nonprofit Alliance is a membership association for nonprofit organizations as well as for corporations that work in the nonprofit space. And as you said, Jeff, a lot of the issues that we focus on are not down at the programmatic level of nonprofit organizations, but really are those overarching issues that either clear the runway or don't for the important work that nonprofits do. And so, Andrew, I really join ASAE and Jeff and others in thanking you and thanking Chairman Neal for the really important work that has been done, the repealing the UBIT burdensome provisions that were really impacting nonprofits, and you were key in that. We had more than 40 meetings on that issue, worked hand in hand with Jeff and ASAE, and so really appreciate everything that you did to help us along with that. And now we're really focused again with lockstep with Jeff in expanding the PPP provisions to go beyond 501c3s, C3s, and really include all the 501cs, including C6s like associations. So again, just really pleased to be here and looking forward to the next hour.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Scott, the floor is yours if you would like it.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and certainly it's a pleasure to be here with Shannon and Andrew. And Jeff, I'm afraid that after your introduction, if we had any participants who are University of Michigan alumni, we might have lost them. But go Bucks nonetheless. So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. My name is Scott Wiley, and I have the honor of serving as the President CEO of the Ohio Society of CPAs, but really it's my great privilege to be able to serve now as the chair of ASAE's Public Policy Committee and getting to work with Jeff and Mary Kate Cunningham and Chris Best, and Nate Fisher on the important work that ASAE is doing in this space. And really I want to talk about a couple key issues. I think it's important for us to recognize that now more than ever is important for our association community, and certainly all of us as association executives and professionals, to really work together to collaborate in advancing a bold and aggressive agenda that can help not only highlight the impact that America's associations have on our economy, and certainly will have on creating a way forward for our economy and those who depend on it, but also in doing so in a way that brings people together. Associations by our nature are conveners of people. We are designed to become inclusive and to create welcoming environments for all, whether that's in the disciplines, whether that's in the professions, certainly in the industry space, but by our nature, we are an inclusive organization and certainly are designed to be that way. And I can think of no greater time, certainly in our country, as we are seeing significant pain and hurt and exhaustion and frustration, for associations to stand up and to speak up and to raise our voices on the issues that matter. Now, as it relates to the importance of American Associations Week and what we have seen this week, and as we stand up and speak up on the issues of importance, I did want to highlight a couple initiatives that ASA has continued to lead from the front on our behalf that I know are of importance. In 2018, ASA formed the UBIT Coalition, and now that has over 115 member organizations, many of whom are on today's call. And that coalition helps to advocate for the repeal of sections 512A6 and 512A7. Specifically, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, signed into law in December of 2017, created section 512A7 to levy a 21% tax on nonprofit employers who provide parking and or transit benefits to their employees. Now, a separate but related provision of the act prohibited for-profit businesses from deducting parking and or transit benefits provided to their employees. Now, congressional intent at that time was for this section to ensure parity between nonprofits and for-profits. But according to a study commissioned by Independent Sector, tax-exempt organizations will divert an average of $12,000 annually from mission-oriented programs due to this tax and its administrative costs. And that's but one of the areas where ASA is continuing to keep a focus to make sure we're advocating for our profession and those who serve in it. Another key area that we've talked a lot about this week is, as a result of this pandemic, how associations have been impacted, and in many cases, how their businesses have been devastated, and the need for the association community, specifically the 501c6 community, to have access to government relief, such as the PPP. And so obviously we've had an opportunity to talk about that. In my role as Public Policy Committee Chair, I want to make sure I'm sharing with all of you, my peers, the importance of the work that ASA is doing and the importance of us needing you to engage with us in that work. Certainly we're building a grassroots army to engage, to tell our story. That is the power of A. But it's equally important for us to remember that as a community, if we stand for nothing, we fall for everything. but as a community who understands that we do stand for something powerful, meaningful, and important: people. That our agenda is the people's agenda. And now is the time as a community for us to stand up, speak up, and make our voices heard. And I want to thank you for your support of American Associations Week and ask you to not to give up, to keep pushing, to keep calling, to keep making the ask. And thank you for what you're doing. It matters.
Thank you so much, Scott. And I very much appreciate you plugging the power of A there, because that is truly the message, not just for ASAE, but the purpose of this week is we associate, we are a community, and our voice collectively is louder than it is individually. And Shannon, thank you as well for your intro remarks. Andrew, I'm going to move to you and introduce you for a brief moment. For those on the line who may be less familiar with Congress and everything along those lines, the Ways and Means Committee is the oldest committee in Congress and the original tax writing committee, and is by all means an extremely important committee. And Andrew, as a senior staff on the House Ways and Means Committee, is a very important person on Capitol Hill. And in a similar sentiment to the one I shared about the Nonprofit Alliance, and very early on in my tenure with ASAE, rewind again back to maybe not March of 2019, but April, I had at that time what was my first very important meeting with ASAE, and that was with Andrew. This is also probably news to Andrew, but it was in regard to the UBIT issue that Shannon and Scott have both spoken to. And of course, it being the first major meeting that I had in my new role, and a month, maybe 6 weeks in, I probably could still have used work on, understanding the issues and being able to truly represent ASAE the way I needed to. So I was probably a little bit nervous walking into a meeting with the chief tax counsel for the majority on Ways and Means, but it was only a moment or two into the meeting that I realized Andrew was not only a welcoming person on the Hill, but was more than willing to share his knowledge and perspective and expertise, and that kind of approachability and open-mindedness and pragmatism and welcoming nature for me as an individual is very much appreciated, but also for what I do as my day job. It was very refreshing, and I've appreciated Andrew very much since then. And we've participated in a panel about UBIT and have gotten to know each other decently well. So Andrew, I want to say thank you to you for joining us, because I know that your time is fairly precious, particularly in the lens of COVID and how fast-paced things are these days on the Hill. But I also want to, again, celebrate you with ASAE's Sentinel Award, because truly the reason we decided to give you that, and thank you for accepting, of course, is because of that genuineness and generosity. Because just as associations are a critical aspect of Americanism and our democracy and our government, so is the presence of smart and decent people within government. And I consider you to be such, and I thank you very much. And please do accept our Sentinel Award. So I'll go ahead and hand it to you.
Thank you. I mean, those remarks are really kind of you to say. I actually I was delivered the actual award, so I can hold it up for as proof positive that it is in fact here. So thank you very much for hand delivering this award. In fact, really appreciate it. I'll just keep any remarks I have short, in the sense of, as you all were talking, I was sort of just sitting here kind of reflecting on, folks mentioned that you had 40 odd meetings with the UBIT Coalition and the like. And of course, on that issue in particular, I took meetings not only with your good organization, but many other organizations that came in. It was obviously a pressing issue for a good number of folks. And I was reflecting on the importance of coalition building, as Scott was talking about, and just how drastically things have changed in the past 3 months in the way we do our work on Capitol Hill, and reflecting about the importance of the importance of the way we did things in the past, and the idea of how difficult it is to replicate those kind of in-person, face-to-face meetings where you really get the sense of coalition building and the like, and you really get the sense that there are a large group of interested stakeholders here that care about this issue. And which is not to say that we're not doing our job or can't do our job in these kind of remote settings, but the world has changed somewhat, and it represents something of a challenge to you all, frankly, in terms of continuing that, on issues that you care about and issues that come up. And it's almost like it's unfortunate because as soon as you solve one issue, you have your PPP issue. And I know that it just sort of seems like, it's one thing after the other, but it keeps you busy, I guess. But it is something that I was thinking about. It's a challenge for you in at least in 2020, and who knows for how much longer. The idea of showing people on the Hill like me, a unified front is really important. And in-person meetings were actually a really big part of that, a really important way to do that. So I guess all I'm saying is part of what made the efforts last year so successful were how frequently folks were in touch, and how well organized you were. And so I guess I'd implore you to, as you move forward to 2020, think of ways to continue to do that, notwithstanding the fact that we can't be physically present, because it is really one of the most important things you can do as an advocate to make sure that your voices are heard.
That's excellent, Andrew. Thank you so much. And again, appreciate your support with the UBIT issue, and obviously Chairman Neal as well with the Ways and Means Committee. I was remiss not to mention that Chairman Neal had introduced and the committee had passed the Economic Mobility Act. That was in fact, I looked this up today, was in fact introduced a year ago today. So I think,
no kidding.
I think that's pretty interesting. So thank you for that, and obviously thank you to Chairman Neal. You pretty much hit on the points of my first question, so I'm going to divert a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure, of course.
So not to overlap too much with Shannon and Scott, before we jump into questions related to future COVID relief, can you give your perspective on some of the emergent legislation that has been popping up recently that up until maybe 2-3 weeks ago wasn't necessarily on the radar, and that might potentially elongate the timeline for COVID relief? So I'm thinking some of the issues addressing civil unrest and police reform. I know that NDAA is going to be introduced. I know that's not necessarily your jurisdiction, but if you could just give a perspective on kind of how things fit into place moving on to the next COVID relief.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say that as we are so on my committee right now we are very busily preparing an infrastructure package, which is something that the House would really like to vote on the week going into July 4th. We're preparing a package related to the ASAE as well. Another thing that we're planning on voting. The House is doing a lot of voting in the last couple of weeks of June. I will say that much. Police reform, DC statehood. These are all things that our members have cared about for a long time. But the caveat behind all of that and all of that work was be prepared to switch at a moment's notice if we start ramping up on COVID negotiations, because making sure that people are safe and people have money in their pockets right now is really a first and foremost priority for the House, as you can see by the HEROES Act. which we passed pretty much along party lines, unfortunately, but a real strong statement that we really think that more needs to be done here. In terms of timeline, the administration has given an indication that they will start negotiating on a follow-on relief package, quote, in earnest, after the July 4th holiday. It is somewhat unclear what that package will hold, but I would say that the real factor that perhaps delayed a follow-on relief was not so much the intervening, policing legislation and the like, as much as I think the jobs report probably contributed to delaying action for roughly a month or so. With good jobs numbers, it kind of gave the Republicans a little bit more leeway to say, oh, we can wait and see. But it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that the Republicans are going to have to act in some fashion, especially as pandemic unemployment insurance winds down as we near the end of July. So I think realistically, in terms of timing on the next big, CARES 2.0 or whatever you want to call it, I think that's sort of the time frame you're going to be looking at here.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I think Scott, do you have the next question?
I do, Andrew. Again, thank you. So obviously, folks are aware the CARES Act. It included various provisions and a lot of financial relief. And so while the PPP is primarily a small business committee issue, I know that the payroll retention tax credit came out of Ways and Means, and your committee is involved in just about all of those conversations. Can you talk a little bit about the CARES process from your vantage point as a senior staffer in the committee?
A great question. So the first thing to remember about the CARES Act is that it was actually written in the Senate, which obviously for tax legislation that's somewhat unusual, but it was much more than tax legislation, obviously. So different committees kind of interacted with this in different ways. The primary way that the Ways and Means Committee interacted with our colleagues in the Senate was through two ways. One was just simply through back channels. We have we have our colleagues, our Democratic colleagues in the Senate Finance, we have their email addresses, and we kept on needling them, asking for more information, giving them suggestions and the like. But the other way we influenced the process had to do with there was a much forgotten House package that was also released right around the same time as the first version of the CARES Act was released. It was a massive piece of legislation, and it really served to reinforce the fact that the House was also going to have to vote on this bill. And you mentioned the employee retention tax credit. One thing that was actually in that bill was the employee retention tax credit, and it was not in the first version of the CARES Act. It was basically our way of saying, we think this is an important tool that can be used to bolster employment here. So the Republicans looked at it and they said, we'll bite. And so we went to the negotiating table, my staff and my Ways and Means counterparts on the Republican staff, as well as the Senate finance staffs on both sides, and the White House. We had a long call where we sort of hashed out a compromise. We think that the employee retention credit, as in the tax code right now, is frankly too small and not really significant enough, especially because you can't use it if you receive the PPP loan. But we were excited that we were able to get that tool in, and as been seen in the HEROES Act, we're really looking to expand it a lot. But that was sort of the way the House influenced that process, and of course we influenced it even more in the context of unemployment insurance, for instance, where we were really insistent on having the pandemic insurance provision in there.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Go ahead, Shannon. My apologies.
No, Andrew, you mentioned already about CARES 2.0 or HEROES Act, the next big relief package. And I say next, we all expect it to be the last relief package, at least until after the November elections. And it passed House on party lines. There are some real differences of opinion and policy with the Republicans in the Senate. Are you able to expand or share any insights on what some of those sticking points are and how you see negotiations kind of falling out in the next few weeks?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think so there are some tax sticking points. Obviously, they're more important, even non-tax sticking points. One of the biggest sticking points will simply be price tag. Mitch McConnell has stated he wants the bill to cost no more than $1 trillion. Obviously our bill costs in excess of $3 trillion. All the advice that we've been hearing from economists here are telling us that we should not be worrying about deficits now. We have to go big in order to make sure that we spare ourselves a lot of long-term grief. And I think that we really took up that mantle in the context of the HEROES Act. I think that you're going to see a lot of sticking points around liability and in terms of businesses reopening. Obviously, the Republicans have made this a priority. Democrats are pushing back. There strikes me as being room for compromise. It is not my specialty in any way, but just sort of reading popular press accounts of both sides. My take is that there's a middle ground here to be reached in terms of liability provisions. Then in terms of other sticking points, I think obviously aid to states is something that's very important to Democrats here. That's pretty much going to be a non-starter in terms of this next round. And then lastly, there's an issue related to unemployment insurance and work incentives, which is it's a sticky issue, but again, I don't think intractable in the sense that there does seem to be room for a compromise in potentially expanding pandemic uninsurance, but perhaps providing a carrot for individuals to return to work in some way, if they choose to do that. It seems to me like that there's room in all those areas that I've outlined to bridge some sort of compromise, which is why I think we will have another bill. It's just sort of a question of when it shakes out and in the magnitude.
Thank you.
So I guess along those lines, Andrew, do you see including 501c6 organizations in the Paycheck Protection Program as well, quite frankly, as reauthorization of the program itself as real possibilities in a next package?
Well, certainly on the C6 question, I'm almost certain it was included in the HEROES Act that the House included not just E6s, but virtually all 501 organizations. But as for re-upping or reauthorizing the program, I think that is a little bit thornier to me as what the future of doing another full like 3 months or what have you worth of payroll or another slug of cash. It doesn't strike me as quite as likely as for instance including C6s in the PVP, but I think that there's good momentum behind doing that anyway. It was clearly something that Ms. Velasquez prioritized when she in her contributions to the HEROES Act.
So let me just play with that a little bit. So based on what you shared and what your sense of the mood is, there might be a greater mood to include C6s. Certainly that was included in HEROES Act, but there might not be as much of an appetite to extend the program, i.e. put more money into the program. So some of the numbers I've heard recently is there's about 120 million, 120 sitting out there. So if I'm a C6 sitting here today, hearing that, it might behoove me to begin thinking about with my finance team and my board leadership about, hey, if we're hoping we can leverage the PPP, if in fact that becomes available, that we should be ready. Because I will tell you from my perch working in the CPA profession, one of the things I hear from my members who are working with small businesses that have access to this, the part that gets a little tricky is the pace at which you can work with your financial institution, right? So if what you've shared could be in fact reality, it would seem like C6s should prepare themselves for when this becomes available. It might be well, the money's there till the money's not there. Is that a fair assessment?
That strikes me as fair. Especially the fact that the program was extended to the end of the year in terms of the loan repayment dates and the like, and the rehiring dates and the like. Certainly gives you the sense that they wanted to be made useful through the end of the year. But there does not seem to have been a whole lot of movement to plus up the dollar value in the House at this point.
I appreciate the candor.
Sure.
Andrew, shifting away a little bit, and so let's dare to think beyond COVID here for for a few minutes. What are some of Chairman Neal's other priorities in the short, medium, and long term as you look at the agenda on his plate and your plate?
Chairman's got a lot of priorities. I will say that. As I mentioned before, we are working on a big infrastructure package, and that is always has been a really big priority for the chairman. I don't think that the package that the House will be voting on is going to be on a rocket ship to the president's desk per se, but it really is meant to be our a starting point. A very serious starting point in conversations with the administration. The president said that he wants to do, I think he said, a $1 trillion infrastructure package recently in the news. And, as we enter presidential election season, it may be that he feels like he really needs to do that. And so the chairman speaks with Secretary Mnuchin, quite frequently. And the secretary, insists that this is something that the administration is serious about. So this is our opening salvo in demonstrating what we really can inject into the economy in terms of infrastructure investment here as a way of starting really starting the conversation. Chairman's also very concerned about retirement security. Last year, he was very proud to have enacted the Secure Act, which makes a whole host to various retirement provisions. I think he's going to be looking to advance what we at least call internally the Secure Act 2.0, which has as some of its features, some of the more important things that the chairman has been pushing for a while, like automatic 401k enrollment, as a way of nudging employees to save for retirement and the like. Similarly, the chairman has been a really big advocate of provisions that provide assistance to low-income taxpayers, such as the earned income tax credit. We have in HR 3300, as Jeff referenced earlier. That's a bill that contained a provision that significantly expanded the earned income tax credit for childless workers, who are essentially the only individuals who the tax code taxes into poverty, because the earned income credit isn't large enough to offset their payroll taxes. Additionally, it contained a massive expansion of the refundable child tax credit. The way the child tax credit works now, the poorer you are, the less of a child tax credit you get, which is which is exactly the reverse of what we want to see in terms of making efforts to end child poverty. So the chairman has been focused on that as well. We included provisions to that effect in the HEROES Act just for 1 year for taxable year 2020 as a way of bolstering individuals' income as the social safety net continues to fray for 2021. When they're filing their returns, they would get a check. It would continue to make sure that they had money in their pockets. And so we're going to be making a big push on those refundable tax credits too.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, that's great, Andrew. Thank you for so much terrific information. I've got a question for you to pivot a little bit. Since the start of COVID and all of the relief packages, we've focused primarily on PPP inclusion, as you would guess, and also the Pandemic Risk Insurance Act. But one newcomer we have recently is the Skills Renewal Act, HR 7032. introduced by Congressman Kilmer from Washington, but that also has several bipartisan members on it already. And what that would do is provide to any American worker who has been furloughed or laid off due to COVID-19 a $4,000 tax credit to pursue post-secondary skills training and career development. And while ASAE has spoken with some of those offices and proposed amendments to broaden the language to apply to other credentials and certifications, we are very excited about the bill and have been expressing vocal supports throughout this week and amongst our members and constituencies. So if you could please just give your perspective, maybe Chairman Neal's perspective, any interesting intel you've heard about the bill.
So I guess what I'd say is, sort of speaking at 10,000 feet, skills training is going to be really important, and I've been hearing a lot from members about that. There's no doubt that with kind of massive job dislocation we've seen over the past 3 months, where really there are going to be industries where jobs just aren't coming back at this point. That there's going to have to be some sort of significant effort to retool people's skills. And frankly, this was brewing before COVID even arose. There has always been a lot of interest in members trying to figure out what do we do about job training, because they hear from employers in their district all the time. We have job openings, we just don't have the people to fill them. They're just these are highly skilled jobs, and the job training isn't there. So for things like apprenticeship training, going back to school to learn a new trade, these are things that members are really interested in. So I'd say that the bill you referenced is definitely going to be part of the conversation as we move forward with that kind of as we move forward thinking about those, how to get people into new careers. There's no doubt that Mr. Kilmer's bill will be front and center in terms of thinking about our options here.
Andrew, obviously we can all of our participants can probably tell we're all not working in our regular places of work today, which is the case clearly for many Americans, certainly many in our community. And we're hearing the stories about how the work of Congress has changed in this virtual environment, and less interaction. Some of the bills are becoming more leadership driven. Something I guess I want to maybe ask about specifically, Congressman Hank Johnson and Congressman Steve Chabot, Democrat and Republican, have introduced legislation in the House, which also has companion legislation in the Senate by Senator John Thune and Senator Sherrod Brown from my home state here in Ohio. And that's the Mobile Workforce State Income Tax Simplification, or State Tax Simplification Act. And in essence, it would establish a uniform threshold where workers could be required to file and businesses to withhold tax only after an employee has worked more than 30 days in a state. Specifically, I'm going to make some assumptions that there's probably some congressional staffers who are probably working back home and have been doing so over the last 30 days. So this legislation, it's bipartisan. It would allow Americans who work across multiple jurisdictions from being taxed by state and local governments other than the places where they live or perform duties over an extended period of time. Has Ways and Means, in light of the environment we're all working in, certainly as a result of COVID-19, given any look at that? And certainly a number of associations are impacted by this, both in a coronavirus environment and not, given the amount of time that our people travel all over the country.
So it's an issue that's definitely been brought to my attention because we're definitely in a circumstance now where we are, especially if you're talking about states that don't have any sort of contractual agreement between them, we're in a little bit of a new world in terms of your physical location of employment not matching, what his states have historically viewed as their physical location of employment. And some folks have shared, I can't remember if it was that bill, but I've seen a few different bills floating around, to be honest with you, that try to deal with this problem. an interesting fact, though, about the Congress is that is actually not Ways and Means Committee jurisdiction. That is because it deals with state taxation. It actually falls into the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee in the same way that they deal with remote sales tax issues as well. But because we do have some knowledge in tax, people do run this stuff by us as well. And you know, so suffice it to say, we've been kept apprised of these issues, and I haven't had any real in-depth conversations with my colleagues over at the Judiciary Committee, but it's something that I think certainly before the end of the tax year we're going to have to address.
Great, thank you.
We received a follow-up question from someone in the audience to my last question, Andrew, and the comments that you shared on infrastructure. And both parties have indicated an interest in this, and yet it remains difficult. Can you further elaborate on what you see as potential moving forward and what it'll take?
Yeah, so I mean, I obviously, you know, one of the difficulties is always in sort of, you know, how do you pay for this infrastructure investment? And so there are obviously a few options. You know, the problem in particular in 2020 is that, you know, it's an election season, and there are just not many people on Capitol Hill who really want to be seen raising the gas tax during an election year. Although there are plenty now who have given me the indication that actually they don't mind, that they don't think it's as difficult a vote. One thing that might potentially make this year different is that you know, because there seems to be so much desire for stimulus spending going on now, that it's possible that lawmakers will simply say, like, well, let's deficit finance this investment and, you know, worry about paying for it down the road. Congress has occasionally been known to do that under certain circumstances. But suffice it to say that generally the roadblock, because the questioner is right, the ideas themselves, you know, the dessert, so to speak, in infrastructure legislation generally tends to be pretty bipartisan. You know, there are some things that Republicans don't like financing, and there are some things that Democrats don't like financing, but most of them like roads and they like rail. But it's really the disagreement over if and how to pay for these things that tends to really gum up the works. And so maybe there's a path forward. It's just a little bit unclear.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. I would like to tie things back to something we talked about earlier on the UBIT issue, and a concern I think some members of our community share in this, you know, near future where money might need to be made up, you know, and things might need to be paid for. What is your perspective on any future potential considerations around that unrelated business income tax, at least in kind of the way that it was applied in 2017, where statute around income was transitioned a little bit to apply to an expense, and you still saw that tax. So do you think there is any real possibility that something, excuse me, similar to that could be conjured down the road when monies need to be made up? And if so, any advice for members of our community?
My guess is that Congress will have a pretty long memory about this particular foray into the old UBTI inclusion gambit. It didn't work out well, did it? And so I would have to say that I would be really, really surprised if a future Congress, you know, within, you know, medium-term memory tried something like that again, because it really does seem, I mean, like the outcry was really, really loud, and you know, I think the Republicans were really pretty embarrassed by the whole thing.
Well,
go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, you know, we certainly tried to make our voice loud and clear. So while we didn't want to necessarily, you know, make anybody feel embarrassment, I think most parties are in agreement that maybe that move might not have been the right one. But with that, Scott, go ahead.
So Andrew, without asking you to do your best Charlie Cook or political prognosticator, obviously we've got a major election happening in November. I know that wasn't news. Any idea? Do you have any forecasting you might share on how some of the scenarios we've talked about here, specifically as relates to issues of tax and these issues, play out as a result of the forthcoming election?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So I guess what I would say is if the result of any election is a government that is not divided, so White House, House, and Senate all the same party, unless rules in the Senate with respect to the filibuster change, which is a possibility, but I wouldn't say likely. Then you're probably in a situation where sort of like the Republicans did to enact the TCJA, the Democrats would be relying on a budget resolution in order to pass whatever significant priority they wanted to pass. That always is very difficult, of course, because it first of all requires some sort of budget, some sort of target number, and that you have to meet, and it also requires agreeing on the entire party agreeing on what their priorities should be, which is not always easy, and certainly would not be easy within the confines of the Democratic caucus. Obviously, there are a lot of folks in the Democratic caucus that care deeply about poverty and child poverty. There are others that care deeply about conservation and the environment. Others, and of course, healthcare is something that tends to drive the party in terms of elections and the like. It's not really clear what would be the party's focus in that kind of winner take all legislation situation. It would, it's a type of thing that is generally led by an administration in the same way that President Obama led Obamacare. If you have mixed government, then I'd say you could look forward to pretty much what you've seen here. I'd say pretty much what you saw in 2019. 2020 has been a very unusual year because of COVID, of course. But I think we're talking, generally speaking, somewhat unless we can really reach out and compromise on things like an infrastructure package, which is possible, of course. We're talking about more incremental types of legislation in divided government. That's just sort of my general thoughts on what kind of tax legislation you would see under those scenarios. And of course, if we lose the House, I may not have a job. So in that scenario, where if the Democrats lose the House and the White House, we may see some sort of rehash of the TCJA in terms of making those provisions permanent. I would imagine a big tax cut bill, essentially, if I had to guess.
And Andrew, in the small event that did occur, you remember you have two things. You have an ASAE Sentinel Award, and you have a community that knows the good work you do. So I'm sure there's some friends here that would love to talk to you.
Thanks.
Nice to have the promise of a soft landing, isn't it? Many of our ASAE members represent industries that are connected to international trade. So if we can go in that direction for a minute, yesterday the Trump administration called for a broader reset of global tariffs. Can you share any forecast you have on next steps for the trade war?
Well, it is, and oddly, the trade war has really touched tax in a lot of ways, for us, because yesterday we were also somewhat, very surprised to learn that Secretary Mnuchin had sent a letter basically withdrawing from the OECD process in terms of their discussions on digital services taxes. And of course, the United States had also instituted some Section 301 investigations with respect to, I think it was nine countries who were either had instituted digital services taxes, planning on instituting them, or had proposed them in some way. And of course, with the 301 investigation, that the administration's invariable remedy has always been to impose tariffs. We do not like tariffs. We do not think that they are a good or productive solution to the various trade policies. And at the very least, we want the administration to look into alternate remedies other than tariffs as a result of their 301 investigations, in terms of thinking about fees for services and the like, especially in the context of digital services taxes. But suffice it to say, I don't think the news of the United States kind of disengaging from the OECD process there serves as good news in terms of thinking about tariff reduction and the like. So we're certainly monitoring it with a pretty wary eye, because we think these kinds of restraints on trade are harmful to the economy overall, especially as we're trying to recover from a massive dip in employment.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been an incredible discussion. Andrew, obviously, thank you so much for your candor, and Shannon and Scott for your wisdom and expertise. I'd like to hand it to you, Shannon and Scott, if you guys want to provide any closing remarks before we wrap up.
Go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, I was just going to say, go ahead, Scott. So I'll take it. I just want to, one more time, Andrew, thank you for the work that you've done alongside us, and really echo Jeff's comments about, how great it is to be able to come to the Hill, walk into a meeting, and have you meet us where we are. And you spoke early on about how challenging it is and how important it is for us to continue that kind of coalition work and coming together with one voice and representing our interests and bringing that to you and figuring out how to do that in the age of COVID. And I can certainly say from the association perspective, that ability to have fly-ins, to be able to, we're on the ground in DC all the time, but to be able to have our members come in representing their causes, their issues, the people and communities they serve, and be able to bring them to the Hill, to come in and have those connections, for some of them the very first time, maybe the only time, and just so appreciative not only of the work that you're doing day in and day out, but the fact that you take that time and really listen and have those meaningful conversations. So congratulations on your award, and thanks so much. We look forward to continuing to see you more in person or on screen, one way or the other.
You're here, and Shannon, thank you for joining today. And Andrew, thanks so much for spending time with us and really giving us some insight that otherwise we would never be able to get. And I guess what I want to say is I want to talk to those who are joining us today, and those who are joining us today and the people they'll talk to. I think what you hopefully have heard over the last 45 to 50 minutes is the complexities that are involved with the types of legislative environment we are now working in. And the whole purpose of American Associations Week has been for ASAE to create a platform for us, to be able to talk about the impact that associations make for those in the positions of influence who are looking at tax legislation and other policies, other laws that can really have a positive impact on propelling the American economy forward following this pandemic. And we know the role that associations can play in. And this week is a bit about creating a platform for us to be able to tell that story more succinctly and to demonstrate the impact that associations will have in the economy. If you have not had an opportunity to do so yet, I implore you to consider signing on to ASAE's sign-on letter, to talk about how we can communicate with the members of Congress who are writing this legislation, to talk about the impact that associations make. Your name and your organization will make a difference. If you haven't done so, talk to your CEO or your other senior leaders about that work. Talk to your colleagues and other associations about how they too can join. Together as a community, we can raise our voices, we can speak up, and we can stand up as one to build this coalition stronger than it is today, to make sure we're not only sharing the power of A, but we are demonstrating as a community, we do stand for things, and we do stand for people. And now more than ever, those people are going to be what are a part of bringing our American economy stronger than it's ever been before. So you matter, and your work matters. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really do appreciate you, speaking the same language and spoken like a true policy committee chair. So thank you very much. And Andrew, before I'd like to give you the last word, but before I hand it over, I just want to reiterate what everybody has already heard from Shannon and Scott to say thank you so much for joining us. We are honored to provide you the Sentinel Award. And also thank you to everybody who has been on today and at any point, frankly, during this gargantuan week that we, for some reason, decided to do. But it's been a blast. I truly hope that people have found value from it because we really did try to put in some time and hope you enjoyed it. But thank you again to everybody and to Scott and to Shannon. And to you, Andrew. So if you would like a moment, please feel free.
Well, thank you again. Obviously, the work I do is really a product of who the chairman is and what the chairman wants us to do. So I should not take credit for something that I really believe is genuinely his mission. But I will anyway. I suppose. But no, I really, this was a really, really flattering hour. So I really appreciate your giving this to me, and thank you so much. It's been great.
Well, it is truly our pleasure, and I, for one, very much look forward to working with you and obviously Shannon and Scott as well. So thank you so much. I think that's a perfect time to wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful inaugural American Associations Week. And you take care, enjoy the weekend ahead, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.